an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, here we go. We make the turn into November. Welcome in. It is the 1st of November. Hope you managed to get through your Halloween just fine. Yeah. Not a lot of activity on our street. It kind of comes and goes every year, right? Ebb and flow. So this is the final week in this part of the world of daylight saving time. We'll move to Eastern Standard Time. Sunday morning means we'll fall back, get another hour. Woohoo! And then, you know what? We will have the endless and the relentless conversation about should we or should we not be turning clocks back and forth. I mean, really, can we get through Friday, the weekend, and Monday without talking about that? Like, surely there are more important things going on in this world right now. Like, you know, the Leafs goalie controversy. Right? Just saying, Samsonov or Wall. That's more important. And is Max Domi really cut out to be a Toronto Maple Leaf? That's more important. So this will be a no-go zone. We won't be talking about the effects on your sleep patterns and everything else. There are more important things, to talk about for sure. Welcome in. It's Wednesday, November the 1st. I'm Dave Trafford. And this is Now and Next for Story Studio Network. And, you know what? There are more important things to talk about. Last week we touched on the federal government's... I don't know who advised on this. This just must have been one of those, explosions in the Prime Minister's brain. When he completely pulled the rug out from underneath himself. That's a feat. When he talked about making changes to the carbon tax and carbon pricing. That is not a nuanced conversation. It's just not. Because for the most part, people don't understand it. Why don't people understand it? It's because media doesn't really understand it. Media isn't really good at reporting on it. It's boring. It's a process story. Right? But climate change and battling climate change is an issue. I'm telling you. And we never saw that more important than this year when we started to talk about wildfires, forest fires. The amount of emissions kicked out by those fires this year was extraordinary. Yep, it's unprecedented. And we get spikes like that all the time in environment and historic, events for sure. But I think it's a good time to kind of revisit that because I saw some of the conversation on LinkedIn over the weekend talking about the need for sustainable forest management practices. And the forest in this country, next to the oceans, are our greatest climate or carbon sinks. Period. And if we don't invest in their health and well-being, then we'll never get out in front of the carbon conversation. You just won't. Period. You won't. So I want to feature a piece we did about a year ago here at Story Studio Network. And the show is called Forestry for the Future, or we did it for a group called Forestry for the Future, but it's called Canadian Forestry Can Save the World. And I know it sounds, slightly ambitious and tongue-in-cheek, but we do that to kind of get people's attention a little bit, right? And you got to understand that the forests and the wood product that you buy, you use, including the books you read, all the paper in that book is a wood product, and it's storing carbon. The kitchen table that you might sit around with the kids, if it's wooden, it's storing carbon, and has been storing carbon since it poked through the ground as a seedling. Yeah, it's storing carbon. The 2x4s in the frame of your house are storing carbon. So we need to understand the context of where the forests and wood product sits. It's not just about fires. I'm going to tell you that there are times when we need a fire. We need fires in the forest. So, yeah, put an ear on this. I'd be really curious to get your feedback on it. If you've got a thought, you can always reach me on the socials. At Dave Trafford finds me on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, X. I'm not going to say formerly Twitter because I think you all know that by now. I'm just curious to see what you got to say about it. Otherwise, if you're listening in Apple or whatever podcast distribution provider you've got, leave us a comment because this is an important conversation. And this particular episode of Canadian Forestry Can Save the World is all about wildfire.
It's the number one natural cause of disturbance in our forests.
Newfoundland battles its largest blaze in 60 years as wildfires rage from coast to coast.
In the lower mainland, take a look at this. Jaw-dropping images from a drone taken above Prince George. The city now on the front lines.
Growing near Los Angeles is one of more than 48,000 wildfires started.
The heat, record-high temperatures are fueling wildfires in Western Canada.
That makes 2022 the most active wildfire season in more than 10 years.
And the latest numbers from the Government of Canada suggest wildland fire prevention costs us more than $1 billion a year.
In the U.S., wildfires accounted for more than $11.2 billion in damages between 2021 and 2022. And those damages and effects of wildfires are all the more dangerous and concerning because they're happening in urban and suburban areas of California, Nevada, and Arizona.
Verisk is an insurance rating bureau in the United States, and their analysis suggests 4.5 million U.S. homes are at high or extreme risk from wildfires, with over 2 million of those homes in California alone.
9 of the 10 worst and costliest wildfires in U.S. history have happened since 2007. The Insurance Information Institute says all 10 of those fires occurred in California, each causing several billions of dollars in insured losses. Now, there's no telling what the uninsured costs might have been.
So with those kinds of statistics and the harrowing images we see of homes and communities being destroyed, it's easy to understand the devastation fires can cause. Here in Canada alone, we have roughly 7,300 forest fires every year, and that's the average over the past 25 years. Those forest fires burn 2.5 million hectares on average per year. That number peaked at more than 4.5 million hectares in 2014 and just over 4.3 million in 2021.
Whether fires occur naturally, usually because of something like a lightning strike, or they're caused by humans, wildfires and forest fires are occurring more frequently and more intensely because of climate change. So where does fire prevention fit into a thorough forest management plan? We obviously want to eliminate the threat to lives and the environment. At the same time, we know the effects of fires can promote healthier, more resilient forests.
Okay, so before we dig into that conundrum, I just want to go back to a couple of things we've talked about in previous episodes of this podcast. We learned that kids' books and movies had a profound effect on our general understanding and the appreciation of forests.
Yeah, we talked to Lacey Rose.
And I'm the county forester for the county of Renfrew in Ontario.
She's a professional forester in Ontario and admits her view of forestry was skewed by a movie.
Every generation has a movie that they saw that gave them a negative impression of forestry. Mine was Fern Gully.
I'm back.
Texas. Maybe you read The Lorax.
I am the Lorax.
I speak for the trees.
And
once there was a tree.
Let's not forget the giving tree.
And she loved a little boy. And every day the boy would come, and he would gather her leaves.
It twists a bittersweet narrative around this whole notion that once a tree's cut down, once it's gone for good. And we know that's just not true.
Yeah, all good. So why are we even talking about this right now?
Well, because the role and the importance of fire in forest management has nearly been set in stone by another cultural phenomenon. This time, a cartoon character, created in the 1940s. He became a household name in Canada and the United States. Literally the poster boy for forest fire prevention. He was a roaring success without doubt. And, I can imagine his story being studied in an episode of Terry O'Reilly's excellent podcast series. You listen to Under the Influence? It's a great show. It's all about marketing and advertising and branding.
It may have been one of the most successful influencer campaigns ever, but the public may have heard the wrong message.
I think you should stick more with podcasting, less with trying to impersonate Terry O'Reilly.
Okay. All right. I just had him in my head, right? And I consider it more of an homage, really, than impersonation. Love the show. But the point here is this campaign made textbook use of the fear factor. A 3-minute-long PSA hit the television airwaves in 1964. It was vivid, it was dangerous, and it was dramatic.
Fire! Fire! Run for your lives!
The forest is on fire. And the dramatic music score highlights the frantic and panicked effort of all the woodland animals to escape with their lives. The long-distance view shows a raging inferno lighting the night sky as it roars across the hillside. And then he steps into the frame.
Please, only you can prevent forest fires.
Ah, yes. Smokey the Bear.
Yes, the Smokey Bear campaign was a huge success, instilling a broad, if not deep, fear of forest fires. The general public was highly aware of the danger and the damage associated with forest fires. And that was only driven home when Smokey became the subject of Paul Harvey's storytelling.
Only you, they would say, can prevent such tragedies as forest fires. And that message, adopted by the National Forest Service, became real through the example of the homeless little creature found whimpering in a smoldering woodland, clinging to the branch of a charred tree, an orphaned bear cub, whom the world came to know and to heed as Smokey Bear. And now you know the rest of the story.
Now, for the rest of the story, he became Smokey the Bear thanks to Eddie Arnold.
If you've ever seen the forest when a fire is running wild.
Now, Arnold was a top Billboard cowboy country singer in the 50s and the 60s.
You know why Smokey tells you when he sees.
He added "the" to Smokey's name just for the sake of the song's cadence, and it stuck.
Smokey the Bear, Smokey the Bear.
And this song was all part of a PSA campaign, the longest running campaign in Ad Council history.
That's why they call it Smokey. That was how he got his name.
So what's the problem here? It sounds like Smokey was not only on the right track, but he clearly struck a nerve with his prevent forest fire message.
True, he did. He's still a cultural icon nearly 80 years later. The problem is, there is a but here. Some scientists blame Smokey Bear for being too successful.
Explain, please.
All right, I want to introduce you to Steve Kozuki.
Hi, I'm Steve Kozuki. I'm with the Forest Enhancement Society of BC as the Executive Director.
Steve is among those who will tell you we have overcompensated when it comes to our understanding of forest fires and how we manage them.
And a big part of that has been fire suppression. You know, the whole Smokey the Bear attitude that fire is bad. and our policy that we're going to put the fire out by 10 a.m. the next morning. And we were very successful at doing that, but we didn't understand the ecological consequences, which are pretty dire.
Thanks to the success of Smokey's campaign, we developed this reflexive cultural response to forest fires. Fire is bad. So fire suppression strategies, fire fights, and preventing fires are all good. But the unintended consequence may be that some forests are overgrown and more flammable.
So really, Smokey's message should evolve and let folks know there is such a thing as a good fire.
Yeah, just as the science of forest management has evolved, a 21st century forest management plan would include things like prescribed burns, in some cases to remove that excess fuel in the forest.
I'm Amy Cardinal Christianson. I'm Métis from Treaty 8 territory, and I'm an Indigenous fire specialist with Parks Canada.
In fact, Amy Cardinal Christianson says there is a place for traditional Indigenous fire practices in modern forest management plans.
Well, I think for the thing that I do, so working with Indigenous fire practices, I think that they would work really well hand in hand with the forest industry, because a lot of it is about preserving forests and the biodiversity in forests. And right now, many of our forests are managed for, a certain species that's harvestable. But I think for Indigenous communities, using fire is about biodiversity, but producing healthy forests. And the thing with that is that you make forests that are less prone to a disturbance like insects or fire. I think that that's where Indigenous practices can fit in really well.
Paul LeBlanc is a forester in Manitoba, and he'd agree with Amy.
I'm the district forester here in Swan River, Manitoba, and I work for Louisiana Pacific Canada Limited.
If someone were to say to you, sort of absolutely, forest fires by any other consideration is a natural disaster, what do you say to that?
Well, that's not true, especially in the boreal forest in Canada. The fire, of course, is what renews and regenerates the forest.
Just talk to me about the sort of the effects of the fire. I mean, in the aftermath of that fire, does that create a soil mix or whatever it might be that helps to regenerate that forest more quickly?
Yes. So in the case of aspen will not sucker unless the adult tree is dead, and then it has different hormones which trigger the suckering response. But it also needs the soil to warm up. Under a mature forest with a canopy, the leaves block the sun and the soil is cooler. The fire burns it, the sunlight hits the ground, and the ground is kind of charred and black. It heats up and causes a tremendous suckering response. And so you get 50,000 aspen per hectare regenerating after a fire. And by the way, that young aspen is very important for ungulates like moose and deer and elk. And the absence of it means they're tight for food. So having some young forest across the forest somewhere at all times is actually quite critical.
So when you talk about suckering, you're talking about trees that are effectively growing out of the original plant?
Yes. So in aspen, the adult root system, aspen roots grow 10, 15 meters long, and each root will produce 15 to 30 aspen suckers from that adult root system. Their growth rate is tremendous because they're a young plant, but they have the adult roots.
It's beginning to sound as if we can't have healthy forests without fires.
So yeah, in some form or fashion, yes. I mean, you heard Paul there explain how a fire can be a natural part of an aspen forest life cycle and the forest life that relies on the aspen stand. And then there are other species of forest that can benefit from the innovative harvesting practices that emulate fire.
But I'm still struggling a bit with the idea that burning a forest stand with all the smoke that comes from that fire is somehow good for the environment. Like, that's a lot of carbon being released into the atmosphere.
Yeah, and there's new research that compares the effects of wildfire to controlled burns.
All the research coming out about like cultural burning practices and the smoke emitted from that compared to these out of control wildfire events show that cultural burning emits less carbon into the atmosphere and less wildfire smoke. And so recently, the American Lung Association just released a study on the importance of using fire in controlled ways in the forest, like that there's no smoke option. Like our forests will emit carbon, but it's just how we do it. We can control when and where that happens and the amount of carbon.
And one of Amy's colleagues at Parks Canada is Landon Shepherd.
I'm the fire and vegetation specialist in Jasper National Park, working for Parks Canada.
He'll tell you we need to understand the role fires play in the renewal of a healthy, sustainable forest. Of course, forest fires are dangerous and they are destructive, but they've always been a part of the natural forest life cycle.
I would think of it as most purely an element of change. And you can add to that and give it a positive spin and say it's a force for renewal and resetting certain ecosystems and restoring certain ecosystems. But that again is applying kind of an objective or what are the implications of that process. You know, at its very essence, it's simply a process of change, and as such, you know, when we start to think of good fire or bad fire, that's us interpreting what we think it's either likely to do or what it has done.
So to this point, we've learned a forest fire helps rejuvenate, regenerate a forest. We've also learned, in some cases, controlled burns are an effective, more environmentally friendly way to prevent the forest fires. And we've learned from Amy that there's a place for cultural fire practices in a modern forest management system. But that still doesn't mean controlled burns can happen all the time, right? It needs to be balanced with harvesting.
Many of our elders, when you go and talk to them now from different nations, they'll say that we can't just go and burn in the forest like we used to because colonization has just made such huge changes to our forests, including the forest industry and some of the management practices that have been done. So what first needs to happen is, you know, substantial thinning or other types of changes, you know, removing some of that fuel through thinning treatments. But I think one of the main issues that come is that much of that needs to be removed through thinning isn't merchantable timber. And so that's where, for a lot of companies, then it's a financial risk to go and do that type of work. But it's really what we need to see happen before we can reintroduce cultural fire practices.
And that raises an important question. What do we do with the wood that isn't good for much other than burning?
What we do, and many Indigenous companies throughout British Columbia are very much involved in going in after the commercial harvesting and taking away that biomass and using that, what used to go up in smoke, using it to create green energy. Now that we make electricity directly from that biomass from the forest and use it here in BC and export it to Alberta, California, or wherever through the power lines. We also make pellets, which are exported around the world. And so when we export energy from the forest to other jurisdictions, there can be another powerful greenhouse gas benefit in taking action against climate change, because that green energy from Canadian forests can often displace energy that otherwise would have been produced by fossil fuels in other parts of the world.
Some of it can be used to create energy that's less harmful than fossil fuels.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that. We're going to spend some time talking about the innovations in the development of wood products and bioenergies in upcoming episodes. But I want to come back to this idea that forest management needs to take fires into account. Paul LeBlanc says he and his team are emulating fire when they consider their long-term plans in Manitoba.
In fact, we did a 20-year forest management plan that we submitted in late 2019, where we're transforming how we manage the forest from a 2- and 3-pass harvest system to emulating fire, natural range of variability. And so what that means is fires create variability, and that's been good for all the animals and wildlife in the past. So therefore, we think that's our best step forward. So we have a variety of what we call serial stages or ages: young, immature, mature, and old. And we want some of that across the landscape at all times. We want some young, we want some immature, some mature, and we purposefully retain old for that, to emulate fire and have better forest management.
So if I'm understanding you correct, you're emulating fire, so you're having the effect of a fire without the fire.
Yes. So we don't burn the forest first and then do some harvesting.
Right.
We harvest in a fashion like fire does. Now, what I've been talking about with the disturbance sizes, that's at the landscape level. Scale is incredibly important in resource management. So at the stand or harvest block or disturbance level, we don't clear cut. We do what's called variable retention harvesting. And that's similar to a fire. Fires have skips. They skip over areas and they leave live trees within the fire. And that's incredibly valuable to wildlife and insects and birds and a whole gamut of wildlife and different species in the forest.
Is the fire emulation sort of your sole or your primary approach to the forest management?
Yes, we used fire emulation or natural range variation as sort of the big picture overall primary cut of how we manage the forest. Our secondary was improving moose habitat, and emulating fire allows us to improve moose habitat a little better. But the really big deal we manage habitat. The government manages moose populations. Moose, you can have fantastic moose habitat, but if the roads are all left wide open and there's lots of them, people road hunt and they shoot all the moose. With a natural disturbance block, we can have a 500 hectare cut block, one road in, dead end. It's easily patrolled. We harvest, we get out, we don't come back for 80 years. And so we have a lot less road that's open and a lot less road hunting of moose.
When we started this discussion talking about the destruction and devastation wildfires and forest fires can cause, the billions of dollars that are spent every year on wildland fire prevention, we highlighted Smokey the Bear's success as the fire prevention influencer. But the science tells us forest fires play an important role in saving forests and the climate.
Well, the cool part is forest management plans use harvesting strategies to emulate the effects and the benefits of a fire without the carbon release. Incorporating fire and the effects of fire actually reduces the likelihood of more catastrophic wildfire, the kind that make headlines, emit so much emissions, and consume an entire forest. So just to punctuate the importance, though, of fires in the forest, Landon Shepherd says forests that do not experience fires are actually more vulnerable.
So vulnerable to climate change impacts like mountain pine beetle is a great example for our Western Canada and Western North America. Really, in a period of 5 years, about 50% of Jasper's forests were affected by mountain pine beetle. That's not to say 50% of the forests were killed or damaged. It's just they were changed. And that's an awful lot of change on a pretty large land base.
And Paul LeBlanc takes it one step further.
Forests that escape burning for 50 years, 100 years, and are significantly older. We have examples in our area where the forest has converted from a forest to non-forest, and it's simply a shrub complex. Then all the value of that and ecosystem services of that forest are compromised. And it's a far less resilient ecosystem. And the solution for those are disturbance, either a fire, or we've done some ecological restoration where we've harvested areas that won't burn and got excellent regeneration and are bringing it back from non-forested back to a forest.
What when you say that they won't burn? How do you qualify that?
Well, there was an aspen hazel area west of here that was falling down, and about 80% of the trees are on the ground, and the hazel shrubs underneath have filled in those gaps, and we've gone from an aspen hazel ecosystem to a hazel ecosystem. So the government tried burning those sites on a dry spring, and they could get a light ground fire going, but there was insufficient fuel to get a crown fire. The trees were too far apart. They really wanted to restore those ecosystems with fire, but were unable to because it had gone too far, too long without disturbance. So we went in and we did a plan for them at their request. They approved the plan, we did some harvesting, and we're getting excellent regeneration back.
So some forests that do not experience fire just disappear.
So at the end of this all, maybe Smokey's message was well-intended, but a little misguided.
Now, to be fair, Smokey's message was targeting our behavior, because the message called on all of us to be careful when we use fire. Good message. The problem is when you say,
only you can prevent forest fires.
It makes it sound as if the fire is bad rather than our negligent behavior.
Yes, some fires are good and can help our forests cope with the climate crisis. In our next episode, we're going to actually sit down at the kitchen table with moms and dads, many of whom probably grew up with Smokey the Bear. We're going to ask them whether they think our forests can actually save the world.
For our producer, Becky Coles, for Aaron and the rest of the SSN team, I'm Dave Trafford. Thanks for listening. This podcast series is produced for Forestry for the Future. And for more information, I'd encourage you to visit the website forestryforthefuture.ca. And you may want to get involved in supporting a sector that's committed to growing a greener economy and driving our country towards a net zero carbon future for you and your kids. I'm Dave Trafford, and Canadian Forestry Can Save the World is produced by Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.